Today for our illustration, we're going to start off with something that's going to help us. It's going to help us with history. It's going to help us to recognize that Abraham was a real person. That's extremely important. Abraham he's not just a name. He's not just some great hero of faith who we have no connection to. He was a regular person just like us. He did extraordinary things only because he trusted God, and he failed lots of times. We're going to see that as well. So what I want you to see today is how our lives connect with Abraham. But the illustration is really cool. I suggest lots of books for you guys to read, and the illustration here, I'm going to suggest a book for you to read. How many of you go and read the books that I suggest you read? Don't raise your hands, because it's not gonna be enough hands. It's gonna be really sad, but you really should. You should take the time. It's amazing. It's amazing. Some of these things are remarkable. So remember, we're not gonna go over this story in the actual, as we go through the text. There's a lot to cover today. So Abraham's life spans more than 10 chapters. 20 chapters almost. 15 chapters in Genesis. And so one of those stories is when he separates from his nephew Lot. You remember we looked at that, or we talked about it a little bit last week. He was always trying to keep his nephew Lot alive because his brother, Haran, had died, and Lot was his son. And Lot, it seems like Lot is almost trying to get himself killed sometimes. And Abraham's trying to keep his nephew alive. This is one of the dynamics in their family. And in one of those stories, you remember Lot, he separates from him, and Lot goes and lives near what city? The city of Sodom. The city of Sodom and its sister city, Gomorrah. Okay, and those two cities, later on, the part we're not going to go into today is that those two cities are eventually destroyed. Lot is rescued by an angel, or a few angels, from the city of Sodom. But the city of Sodom is destroyed, very famously, by fire and brimstone. Or as the Bible, if we were to translate it very literally or woodenly, the city of Sodom is destroyed by something that looks like burning sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens. And in one day, basically these cities, according to Genesis, are vaporized. Okay, so here's the illustration. This is Dr. Stephen Collins. Has anybody heard of him? He has been excavating a particular site in Jordan, northeast of the Dead Sea, well east of Jerusalem, east of the Jordan River, for 17 years. And he actually just finished, in 2023, they finished 17 years of excavations on a particular site in Jordan called Tel al-Hammam. And he has been getting, over the past maybe 10 years or so, Dr. Collins has been getting an increasing amount of press coverage. So, for example, here is, some of you might know who Sean McDowell is, right? Sean McDowell, his dad was a well-known writer of Christian books, and Sean McDowell is a professor at Biola University. He's also been at Momentum, the youth conference that our students go to sometimes. Here's Sean McDowell interviewing Dr. Collins 2 years ago. And I'm going to show you another interview at the end. I'll show you a little clip at the end of this illustration of an interview of Dr. Collins by Eric Metaxas, who's also a very, very well-known guy. Okay, so he's getting a lot of press coverage because of his excavation. I think this book is actually pretty old now, 2014, 2015. Dr. Collins wrote a book called Discovering the City of Sodom. And you should read this book. If you're the kind of person who reads books about history, you should read this book. It has been controversial, but it's becoming less and less controversial. He believes that the site he's been excavating for 17 years is the city of Sodom. And he has a lot to back it up. So all I can do is just touch on this. Now, I don't say this lightly because there's a lot of guys out there who say, oh, I discovered this, or I discovered Noah's Ark, oh, I discovered, in the Middle Ages, almost every church in Europe had a piece of the real cross of Jesus. Okay? Not really true. So I don't say this lightly. I think he probably has discovered the city of Sodom. This is a Google Maps image of the site Tel al-Hammam that he's been excavating for 17 years now. Here's Jerusalem. The Jordan River runs between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, here, right there. So it's east of the Jordan River. Okay, and check this out. I don't know if you can see very clearly what it says on Google Maps on that dot. But if you search for Sodom on Google Maps, now, not in the past, but now, just this last year, they've changed it so that now Sodom redirects to Dr. Collins' site, Tel Al-Hammam. Google has finally agreed with him. That's how mainstream this is becoming, although it's still quite controversial. Here's some pictures. This is Dr. Collins. His wife is one of his close partners in this excavation. This is Dr. Collins and his wife at the site. This is another picture of the site. We could spend hours going over. This is a recreation of what they think that this site looked like. It's definitely a Bronze Age settlement. A few really interesting things about this site. It has all the stuff that the Bible you would expect, according to Genesis, Sodom would have. He also found it by following the directions in the text of Genesis. No other archaeologist had taken the text that seriously. And he followed very carefully what it says in Genesis about where Sodom is, and that's how he began excavating the site. And you can see also, very famously, and this is part of the controversy and why some people want to resist it so much, the site has a very distinct burn layer. At about 1650 BC, the entire site was destroyed and was not inhabited again for 700 years. Super distinct burn layer. And the burn layer is really weird, guys. It's really weird. These are samples of clay, pieces of clay pots from the site. Okay? You can see, we can't go on, you could read the book, or go watch his videos. This side of the clay pot is, a nice piece of clay from a particular type of vessel used in that era, in the 1600s BC. The other side of the same piece of the clay pot has been boiled. It got so hot, apparently not for very long, that the other side of it boiled. This is all over the site. I hope this one isn't too gruesome for you, but the site is also filled with stuff like this. Partial skeletons where the bones have been burned off at a certain level, as if the person were vaporized or part of their body. It's crazy. And in fact, just last year, actually I think this is 2021, maybe it's a couple of years ago, there was an in-depth scientific study published in the journal Nature that argues that what destroyed this city at Tel Al-Hammam was an airburst event. That is, a meteorite exploding above the ground and vaporizing the city. You can go look this up. This is one of the most downloaded scientific papers in the world. This paper is super detailed. Almost all of it's going to be over all of our heads. But if you just Google this, airburst Tel Al-Hammam, boom, this will come right up. This paper has been accessed 600,000 times. Usually scientific papers get like a couple of hundred downloads. Crazy.
The whole story is so...
Okay, now I'm going to show you just a real quick clip. This is Eric Metaxas, so I'm going to need enough volume here, interviewing, and this is the whole thing is long, so go watch the whole interview. It's like an hour and a half long or something. But this is just a couple minutes of Eric Metaxas interviewing Dr. Collins. Check this out.
The whole story is so amazing, and we've just hit the highlights. But if ever anybody, wondered, whether the Bible might be history, the idea that something that happens in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, because most people, I think, would say, well, if it happened, we're certainly not going to be able to find it through archaeology. That's just crazy. It's crazy.
Here's how I would wrap it up. I would say, and because we've been talking about explosions, and that's the neat stuff, right? Oh, how bad was the destruction? But the archaeology is still very powerful. We now know Tel Al-Hammam is the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city north and east of the Dead Sea. In fact, the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. There was a period of over 500 years when Tal Hammam was the only city or city-state operating in the southern Levant. Now, here's what I'm saying. Remember that blank map we had? Nobody put anything on this map. The Bible, the geographies that are written of this area is blank. And here's what I say. If the archaeologists and the cartographers, historians, had paid attention to the Sodom narratives, they would have discovered and taken the Sodom narrative seriously. They would have discovered this wonderful civilization a long time ago, because it's the biggest one. I say, if you try to study the southern Levant without Tal el Hammam, it's like trying to study Texas without Dallas and Fort Worth, France without Paris. I mean, it is the biggest, most important city in the southern Levant for most of the Bronze Age. So if they'd paid attention to the Bible, they would have found it a long time ago. But they didn't pay attention to the biblical text, and they didn't even go looking, and they never found it. We paid attention to the biblical text. We went to that area. We did our due diligence and research on the ground, and now in the ground over 16 years. And the end result was we found it. We found it, and now the world knows about that great civilization.
I just want to...
All right, there's a lot more that could be said there. I don't want to take too much time on it, but I do want you guys to be aware of big things. This is probably the biggest discovery in biblical archaeology of the 21st century. I don't see what else would compare. It's crazy. He found the city of Sodom, and it's almost beyond dispute that he did. Okay, I recommend that book highly, and I also recommend that you take in what he said. As we go through Genesis here, there have been so many people who've tried to say this is just a myth. This is just, it's not actual history. And over again, we find out, when we find this stuff, we find out that the Bible was right the whole time. What does he say in that clip? If they had paid attention to what the Bible actually says, instead of writing it off, most of these archaeologists for couple hundred years now have just written it off like a myth. If they had paid attention to what it actually said, they would have found it a long time ago. It's right where the Bible says it is. Wow. Good, the bad, and the faithful. We are in the middle of the life of Abraham, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Last week we looked at his calling and the promise that God made to him. Abraham was in Ur of the Chaldeans, and God called to him, Genesis chapter 12, and he says, I want you to come and follow me. Come into a new land that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to turn you into a man of faith, and I'm going to use you. I'm going to build you into a new nation, Abraham, and I'm going to use you to bless the entire world. Now, that's a huge promise. Today we're going to be looking at the results of sort of Abraham's whole life. And here's kind of the big idea, guys. Here's the big idea. Abraham, he hears from God. He doesn't even know who this God is at first. We'll talk about that in a minute. He hears from God and he's willing to act in faith. His whole life is like a roller coaster. Abraham is not just a man of faith like this that just goes up and up and up. Sometimes he's trusting this God who has been calling him, and he's full of faith, and sometimes he is terrified. Sometimes he is totally terrified, overwhelmed by his life, thinking that this could never, what God has promised him could never happen, and maybe he made a big mistake in following God. His life is very much like our lives. This is actually what it's like if you're following Jesus. Yes, we have moments when God's doing amazing things for us, and then the next challenge comes into our lives, and we are terrified. And where is our faith gone? And then God shows up for us again, and we feel like, I'm a fool. Why didn't I trust him? This is Abraham's life. This is his life. We're going to look at his testing and the faith that God eventually built into him. I said some stuff last week that a number of you found very surprising. So let me just say a couple of things about that, because I said this last week. I said that when Abraham left his original hometown, Ur of the Chaldeans, He had been called by God, but he didn't know who God was. He did not know which God was calling him. He didn't know the name of God. He didn't have a Bible that he could refer to. We're called to follow Jesus. We have tons of information about, what God has done throughout history. We have the Bible. We have the stories of Jesus and his followers. We have the church. Abraham had nothing. He had this God who said, "Come follow me. I'm going to show you a new land." That was surprising to some of you. He did know a little bit about this God. I will say this. He has a sense, and he has some information that this is the God. This is the God who's kind of behind all the other gods, above all the other gods, the one who really made the world. How does he know that? A couple of reasons. Number one, this God is calling him to go from one land to another land. In those days, most people thought of the gods as very regional, like a god would rule just this particular area. So if you moved to a new land, you had to get new gods. If you went and lived in Egypt, you had to worship the gods of Egypt, because they're the ones in charge there. But whatever God is calling Abraham, he's telling Abraham he's the God in Ur of the Chaldeans. He's the God in Haran, where he goes to for a little while. And he's the God in this new land of Canaan, where he's taking Abraham. He's God everywhere. This is very different. But Abraham doesn't even get to see this God. Right? There's no name, there's no statue to worship. This is the world that he lived in and how people related to the gods. And none of this is present. So it requires a huge amount of faith on Abraham's part. He's also told that he's going to be a blessing to the whole world. That God's going to use him to build a nation that will bless the whole world. Well, if this God can bless the whole world, what kind of God is he? He's the God of the whole world. But Abraham really has no idea what he's doing. He doesn't know how to accomplish this. Would you know how? If God told you to build a new country, go leave Canada and start a new nation, would you know what to do? Probably not. I would not. This is an image we used last week. I think this picture, this painting from 1850, to me, it kind of looks like Abraham's just looking around. And this is really how Genesis 12 feels when you read it. He goes to Canaan. He takes this big, huge leap of faith. Canaan is the Badlands. It's the cursed land. It's the land where little warlords live. Abraham gets to Canaan, and in Genesis 12 it says, and he arrived there. He's there. He doesn't know what to do. This God hasn't told him what to do. He's just told him, go to Canaan. And basically, Abraham wanders around waiting for God to fulfill the promise for 25 more years in Canaan. And this image, to me, gives a sense of Abraham's kind of looking up and kind of looking around. Is somebody going to come kill me? Is this God going to do something for me and fulfill the promise that he's made to me? But like I said, this is the big point. Abraham's whole life isn't about what he achieves in the visible realm. It's not about actually, how many kids he has. He only ever has one child that is part of this lineage that will become the family that blesses the world. Only one. It's not about anything on the outside. It's not about how many camels he has or how many goats or if he owns any of the land in Canaan. He eventually owns a very small piece of land, a cave, and a little bit of the land around it so that he can bury his wife. That's all he ever owns in this land that God said he would give to him. The whole point of what God is doing in Abraham's life is he's building faith. He's building something on the inside of Abraham. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to go through a bunch of chapters of Genesis fairly quickly here without reading them, and then we'll read just a couple of pieces. There are three big themes in Abraham's life. And if you want to read chapters 12 in Genesis all the way up through chapter 24, that's the life of Abraham, and you're going to find these themes over and over. One, I've said already a number of times, he is often anxious and afraid. In this land of Canaan, he's wandering around. He has no army. He has no country to protect him. And there are bosses and bad guys all over the place. Bandits. Warlords. And he's afraid they're going to come kill him. At one point, he ends up down in the country of Egypt. He ends up in Egypt because in Canaan, if it doesn't rain, there's no food. This is part of the problem in Canaan and why there was no big empire there. What was called Canaan, which is now called the land of Israel. If it doesn't rain, there's no food. You have the Jordan River, but it's not big enough to irrigate everything, except for at one place, actually, Sodom. That's why everybody was congregated at Sodom and Gomorrah. So he had to go down to Egypt because it didn't rain one year. There wasn't enough food. In Egypt, they have the Nile River, which is the most consistent river in the world. It floods every year at almost the exact same time. This is why all the people there thought Pharaoh was a god. Pharaoh could make the river flood at the same time every year. Yeah, great trick. Whether he's there or not, it always floods the same time every year. But it was a good way to convince people that you were a god. Okay? So he goes down there. He's terrified of Pharaoh. What does he do? Many of you will know. His wife, Sarah, is super pretty. Super pretty. And he's terrified because Pharaoh is not a nice guy. He's terrified Pharaoh is going to kill him and take his wife. So he tells everybody in Egypt that she's his sister. And that whole story, he actually does that twice in his life with two different bad guys, two different bosses that he ends up around. He's terrified that they're going to murder him because his wife is too pretty. That's a good compliment for Sarah, I suppose. A lot of women in the room are like, yeah, I wish that would, yeah, anyway. But think about the lack of faith that he's got here. And think about what kind of anxiety he was dealing with on a regular basis. He's got all these people in his little entourage depending on him. He has no way to protect them. He's terrified of these bosses and bad guys. He's terrified of a lot of things, actually. A second big theme in his life, which I already alluded to, is keeping his nephew alive. This twice he has to do this. Once he has to get all of his guys together who are not soldiers, and he has to go fight a guerrilla war at night to rescue his nephew from this army that had come and invaded and taken him captive. And he does. In that moment, I think Abraham grew in faith a lot in that moment. I didn't mean a pun there. All my puns are by accident. Okay, but then it happens again, right? His nephew Lot can't stay out of Sodom. And Sodom, God tells Abraham that Sodom is going to be destroyed. In fact, God tells Abraham Sodom is going to be destroyed by fire from the heavens. And Abraham pleads. There's this whole narrative in there where Abraham is pleading, basically negotiating with God. Abraham's like a camel and a sheep trader. And he uses his merchant skills with the Lord. Come on, so what if you find 25? What if you find 50 really good people in Sodom? Will you spare the city? Okay, fine, I'll spare it. Well, what if you only find 25? You wouldn't kill. No, if it's only 25 less, you wouldn't kill it. You wouldn't kill all those people if there's 25 good people. And he barters God all the way down to 5 people. If you can find 5 people in the city that are good enough, then I won't destroy the city. But he doesn't. He saves Lot and Lot's immediate relatives, and that's it. Keeping Lot alive. This is that image we saw last. This is from a church in Rome, an image of Lot and Abraham separating. And then the last theme, and I know probably for a lot of the men in here who are married, you'll relate to some of this, okay? A big theme in Abraham's life is making Sarah happy. And she's often not happy. In fact, she's almost never happy, as far as I can tell in the narrative. And keeping the dream alive. They've had this dream that God called us to come out of this bondage and to come into a new land of freedom and start a nation. And it's going to become this amazing thing. And they've been doing it for 25 years. And then they've been doing it, and then 30 years. And then it goes on, and they don't see it happening. Is the dream still alive? Is it ever going to happen? And Sarah, her longing and her desire has just been to have a child this whole time. And I'm pretty sure Sarah didn't want to go to the Badlands either. It doesn't actually say that, but I cannot imagine she was happy about, let's go wander around in the cursed land where enemy raiders might come in and kill us at any moment, because Abraham heard from God. Could you imagine? Wives, your husband says, I heard from God. We got to go wander around in no man's land. I can't imagine she was happy with that. And you see this in the text. At one point, she tries, because she can't have a child, she tries to have a child through her maidservant. It's a slave. Hagar is one of Sarah's slaves, and she brings Hagar to Abraham and convinces Abraham to sleep with her and have a child so that she can build a family through her maidservant. Of course, as soon as Hagar is pregnant, what happens? Sarah changes her mind, gets super upset, and wants to get rid of Hagar. Sarah is back and forth. You can see it in her life. What is this life we're living? This is craziness. There's this huge theme of Abraham trying to make Sarah happy. In fact, some of his biggest mistakes come from a really good motive. He wants his wife to be happy. But sometimes he chooses that above what God is asking him to do. And keeping the dream alive. Is God ever going to bring this promise to fulfillment? Let's see what kind of progress God made in Abraham over his life. This is Genesis 15, verses 1 to 8. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus, is this hired worker who works for me. I still have no kids after all this time. And Abraham said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky, Abraham. He took him outside. Look at how this text is remarkable. Abram was in his tent when he had this vision. Even just the little things in this text, he took him outside so he could look up at the stars. The story, it's bringing you into this moment in Abraham's life. You see how faithless he is in this moment, really? God has begun speaking to him in a vision, and he does not believe. He does not believe in this moment that God is, how can I be sure? You've said you're going to do this stuff, and it's been 25 years, Lord. Nothing has happened. He took him outside, and he said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And he could not. There was no light pollution. You ever seen the stars when there's no light pollution? Have you? It's stunning. So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, credited it to Abram as righteousness. This is the moment that the Apostle Paul will look back on and teach us about how to follow Jesus, teach us about what faith means in Romans chapter 4. It was credited to him as righteousness. Abram was not a good person on his own, but because he was willing to believe what God said to him, even though he messed up and he doubted over and over again. But you can see as he goes through his life, his faith is growing. It's growing. Why is God putting him through all these chaotic things that seem to make no sense? To grow his faith. That's why. He's growing in particular ways. God says to him, I am the Lord. This is the moment where God finally tells Abraham his name. I said earlier that he didn't know what God had called him in Ur of the Chaldeans. This is the divine name in the Hebrew text, Yahweh. I am Yahweh, he says to Abraham, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. I'm the one who called to you 25, 30 years ago, and I brought you into this land so that you can take possession of it. Sovereign Lord, how can I know? How can I know? What God does after this is remarkable. We were talking about it in our Bible study this morning. God actually enacts a ceremony in a vision for Abraham. God enacts a ceremony that is a covenant ceremony by which kings and chieftains in the ancient Near East would basically say, I'm going to do what I say, and if I don't, I would die. If I don't fulfill this promise, may I be cut into two pieces and killed. the God of the universe, does this for Abraham next. What is Abraham learning over all this time? He's learning what we've already seen earlier in Genesis. He is learning what was described of Adam, what was described of Enoch, what was described of Noah, what was described of all the men of faith. He is learning how to walk with God. And that is the only goal that God has for his life. Yes, God's going to use his life in these stunning ways later, but the only goal God has is that he would learn to walk with him by faith. What does that mean? Walking with faith looks like stuff like this. It looks like following God when he asks us to do something, following the call he has on our life. It looks like receiving the things that he brings. Over and over again, God allows things to come into Abraham's life that Abraham is like, why did you allow this? And we are the same. Abraham has to learn to receive these things. The God who called me has allowed this thing to come into my life. I receive it. I'm going to choose to rejoice in it. I'm going to choose to believe that God is going to use this thing, even if it's a bad thing, like being terrified of Pharaoh coming to kill me. I'm going to choose to believe that God will use it for good. I'm going to believe that God will fulfill all of his promises, and I'm going to believe it no matter what things look like. And here's the thing. God's plan for Abraham worked. It worked. By the end of his life, this is the last text we'll look at today. By the end of his life, Abraham has become a stunning person of faith. I'm going to read the story of him being tested with Isaac, and don't get too caught up on the fact that God is asking Abraham to go sacrifice his son, okay? Don't get too caught up on that. It has to do with lots of stuff in the Bible, lots of stuff in that culture. What I want you to think about as we read this is a horrible thing comes into Abraham's life, a horrible thing. And what is Abraham? Abraham is able to believe in that moment that God will use it for good. What if you had faith like that? What would you be able to accomplish in your life? If when that next thing that comes into your life, there is a next thing coming that's going to terrify you, if you were able in that moment not to just be destroyed by that, but to trust God, to be able to say, I actually believe that God is going to use even this thing for my good and to fulfill his promises in my life. Toward the end of his life, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham replied, I'm here. I'm listening. Then God said, take your son, Abraham, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He went to do it. Do you think he told Sarah? I think there's absolutely no way he told Sarah. Absolutely no way. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. It's a mountain, and the region of Moriah is now the current region of Jerusalem. The mountain that he goes to is the Temple Mount today. It's where Solomon would later build the temple. It's where the Dome of the Rock is right now in Jerusalem. He saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here. Stay here with the donkey while I go with the boy. We go over there. We're going to worship, and then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. So Isaac is carrying it on his back. And he himself carried the fire and the knife, and the two of them went together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father, yes, my son, the fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, and maybe this is the core of the text. The core of the text is not that God asked Abraham to do this. The core of the text is this. Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb. Abraham believes that God will do something good. We're later told in the New Testament that Abraham reasoned that maybe God can raise the dead. Even if he had to do this as an act of faith, God could raise his son from the dead and still fulfill his promise. In the face of hopelessness, absolute hopelessness, the dream is dead, Abraham is able to believe, no, God's still going to do it. God is still going to do it. But it's impossible. God's still going to do it. The two of them went on together. They reach the place. Abraham builds an altar. He arranges the wood. He puts Isaac on it. He reaches out his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel stops him. God also, of course, here reveals his character. To us, some of this might be like, why would God ask him to do this? Many of the gods of the Middle East asked their worshipers to do this. We've talked about before the burning of children in the fire to Molech. This was a common practice, human sacrifice. One of the things God is doing in this section is showing Abraham what kind of God he is and what kind of God he is not. He is not a God that's going to ask you to sacrifice human beings. But he also shows us something later, which he's already shown Abraham, that he is the kind of God who is so committed to us and his promise that he, not us, but he is willing to give up his own son to save us. God provides a ram. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God. I know that you really trust me because you have not withheld your son from me, your only son. And he looks up and he sees a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. God has provided the offering. This is an amazing moment. The point is Abraham's faith. Abraham believes God will use it all for good. This is what God is trying to accomplish in us, that we would be people who can stare hopelessness in the face and say, I still believe that God will do what he promised and that he will use it for good in my life. But it's hopeless. But no, it's not. Yahweh, the Lord, reveals Abraham's character. He reveals what he has accomplished in Abraham. Why is life, sometimes it just seems so chaotic. It just seems, where is this life even leading? God is doing all of this. Not to bring us to some dream that we have imagined in our lives, but to build us into people of real faith, to make us ready for the coming life, to make us ready for the life that is really life, to change us on the inside. Abraham's life has been a faith-building exercise. So is yours, and so is mine. And that's the thing that takes us so long to get it. So long. For those of you who are parents, have you ever had that battle with one of your kids where it seems like there's a thing that they need to learn, a thing that they need to overcome, and it's so hard for them to understand it? In the moment, they're struggling, they're fighting, maybe they're throwing a tantrum in their room, whatever it is. And maybe it takes months or even years for them to learn the lesson. But if you hold fast and you hold your discipline with them, they eventually become more and more what they were made to be. They overcome those things. Many of you as parents have experienced this. Some of you can look back on your childhood and see where that happened for you as your parents held that line with you. This is what God is doing to Abraham. It's what God is doing with each of us in our lives right now. And it explains why life goes the way that it does. Are we able to look to God and praise him for these things? Things that are painful in the moment, but things that he uses to build us into the people that we will be forever. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.